violence in Serbia between government supporters, police and anti-corruption demonstrators who've been on the streets for months demanding elections. President Aleksandar Vucic says the protests are part of a foreign plot to oust him. So why has violence flared up and what's next? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. Months of demonstrations against the Serbian government turned violent this week when police and supporters of President Aleksandar Vucic confronted the protesters, many of whom are students. They've been on the streets since November when the roof of a train station collapsed in Novi Sad, killing 16 people. Demonstrators blame government corruption and are calling for early elections. The government has responded with a crackdown on the rallies, with UN human rights officials citing reports of police brutality. Vucic has reshuffled his government, but says he's going nowhere. Traditionally an ally of Russia, Serbia has shifted more towards the west over Ukraine and is seeking EU membership. So why has the violence worsened? And what are the implications? We'll discuss the situation with our guests shortly. But first, this report from Ama Boateng.
Anger and frustration in Serbia. Demonstrations turn violent. Police confront anti-corruption protesters. The unrest has spread to dozens of cities. And it's intensifying as government supporters stage rival demonstrations. The anti-government protesters want the president to step aside and hold early elections.
I think now is the moment where we should all get out and show that we're not frightened and that their attempts to use violence to stop the people's and the students' protests will not work.
I thought the violence was frightening, paralysing, and something must change as soon as possible.
Students have led largely peaceful rallies for months. In June, more than 100,000 people gathered in the capital, Belgrade, an organic movement brought together by a tragedy in November. The roof of a newly renovated railway station collapsed in the northern city of Novi Sad, killing 16 people. Many blame corruption in state-funded infrastructure projects. Students say a change in leadership is needed. President Aleksandar Vucic has rejected their demands, instead calling them enemies of the country.
Now, more than ever, we need to listen to each other, to understand each other. The protesters have done horrible things in Novi Sad today. They're still doing it. But when you show will to seek peace and discipline, you always win. And Serbia will win.
Vucic has been in power for 13 years. This is the most serious challenge his Serbian Progressive Party has faced. And while the government insists it will crack down on the demonstrations, the protesters say they're determined to bring about change. Ama Boateng, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
We asked the Serbian government to put up a spokesperson to join us on the programme today, but they declined our invitation. So let's bring in our guests. Mirko Dautovic is an international affairs commentator for Balkan media and has participated in the protests. He joins us from Belgrade. Florian Bieber is a professor of Southeast European history and politics at Graz University. He joins us from Hvar in Croatia. And Tatyana Kekic is a correspondent covering Serbia for BNE IntelliNews. She's also in Belgrade. A warm welcome to you all. Mirko, let's start with you. I was in Belgrade just by chance at the beginning of the week and things were pretty quiet. There was virtually no one at the pro-government camp opposite Parliament. So what sparked the violence?
The violence was sparked by intervention of these pro-governmental forces. We could call them thugs as well. They've attacked people in two little towns in northern Serbia, in Vojvodina, in Vrbas and Bački Petrovac, where they showed up basically to terrorize people who were merely at the exhibition of photos, of art photos that also included exhibition of the protests, of the demonstrations that took place throughout Serbia. And it was the exhibition of the Slovak Ethnic Minority Council. They showed up, they prevented people from attending it, terrorized the place, and this sparked counter-reaction in the middle of August. It's no wonder that you didn't see anyone in Belgrade at the beginning of this week, because we are still in Ferragosto. It's mid-August, so most people are away vacationing. And yet these events in Bački Petrovac and Vrbas caused Serbia to rise up again, to wake us up early from our summer slumber. And people are out in the streets, as you could see. We are out in the streets. We imagined that the protests would start again in September, once people come back from the vacation, but the government decided to increase the oppression. As I've already mentioned, you have these thugs. So you see at the moment on the photo, on the recordings that you're displaying, the thugs of the pro-governmental paraforces are launching missiles. These are like football torches that they are launching against the people who have quietly assembled. Between the demonstrators and the pro-governmental thugs, you have a line of police forces that are protecting the members of the ruling party from the anger of the people who have assembled. And these have been the photos and videos from not only Belgrade, but also Novi Sad, the place of the tragedy, but also Kraljevo, Kruševac, Valjevo, Niš. Throughout Serbia, people are rebelling. Okay. And the ruling party is taken out these thug forces, paramilitary, police forces into the streets.
Okay, Mirko, sorry to interrupt you. Let's bring in Florian. Vucic once again accused the anti-government protesters of taking orders from an unidentified foreign source. Now, that's a claim he's made several times before, but has failed to substantiate. What do you make of that claim? Who on earth might he be referring to?
Well, he's been using this strategy for months, ever since the beginning of the protests, and even with earlier protests. He at some point even accused the Croatian intelligence services for being behind the protests, which is, patently rather absurd accusation, mostly because the students organized in plenums, something which Croatian students did more than a decade ago, but certainly no evidence of Croatian involvement. He's blamed unnamed Western intelligence services. It's part of his rhetoric, and he gave a speech a few months ago. He said, this is a colored revolution. This is the terminology which Vladimir Putin uses as well. And so he's saying, I will defeat this colored revolution and write a bestseller about this. Of course, he makes these promises a lot of times. I don't think he'll ever get to write this bestseller or defeat it. But again, it's part of the kind of authoritarian playbook to not accept the legitimacy of these protests, to not accept that these are genuine frustrations of citizens, but blame unnamed foreign forces. And of course, he wouldn't be able to name them, partly because he also tries to keep good relations with Western partners. So he wouldn't want to kind of endanger those by singling out, Germany, France, and others with whom he is actually having economic ties, which are quite good. So he's playing in a certain way the Russian playbook while not trying to burn bridges to the West.
Tatyana, protesters say that authorities brought thugs and provocateurs onto the streets to spark the violence so that the government can use it to discredit the demonstrations and to justify a crackdown on its opponents. Is there any evidence for that? What do we make of that statement?
Well, I think that the protests now have taken on a different form than earlier in the year. When the students seemed to be firmly in control, the protests were organized when hundreds of thousands of people came out onto the streets of Belgrade, Novi Sad, and other cities, and they were largely peaceful. But now the students are still calling for people to take to the streets, but they don't seem to be really organizing them. It's sort of a free-for-all. So while you do have students and peaceful protesters turning up, you also have angry kids probably looking for a fight, coming out, and you have that reciprocated on the other side. I think this unrest potentially plays into the hands of the government, which has consistently portrayed the protesters as terrorists who are bent on destroying the country and of overthrowing the government and generally causing chaos. And that's been the narrative since the beginning. We've seen in recent days, for the past 3 nights, that the authorities are responding and sometimes even initiating violence. They are assembling in large numbers at SNS party offices, but in response, some protesters are taking to violence and smashing up, as we saw last night, offices in Novi Sad. So yes, I think it risks playing into their hands.
Okay, Mirko, how precarious is this situation for Vucic? The protesters are accusing him of trying to provoke a civil war. I mean, how much worse could it get?
Well, what we could and should expect that at some point we have some proper casualties. So far, we've only had injured people, mostly on the side of the demonstrators, few injuries with the police, few injuries with the pro-governmental para-forces, but we are expecting actually for things to become worse. So from what I've seen in the last 2 days, 2 evenings, I have a feeling that the government is increasing the oppression. And you can deduce from that that the situation is rather precarious for the president, who showed up himself 2 nights ago. You know, he rarely dares to venture outside of the designated areas. But 2 nights ago, he did show up in central Belgrade in the park that was occupied by his members of his ruling party. The thing is, he's not due to open for re-elections until early late 2026. This allows him for another 2 years of government, of ruling, which we just don't feel to be right. You can see that the country is rising up, and the only way out, peaceful way out of this, would be for him to authorize the elections, to call for the new parliamentary elections, if not for the elections of the local assemblies, municipalities, and even presidential elections. He will not be doing that, in my opinion, because he knows, based on the polls, that his ruling party would lose the elections. So in that sense, I'm afraid that the violence will continue, will escalate, and that we will have casualties on our side. From where do we go from there? I can't tell you. But the citizens are really in high numbers. They're showing up in high numbers. And what Mrs. Kekic just referred to, the appearance of these more aggressive characters in our streets, yes, that is true, but I would also say that this is a pure response of the youth, because now they see that the government has no intention of backing down. They haven't fulfilled any of the demands.
Florian, the protests perhaps constitute the most serious challenge against the 13-year rule of Aleksandar Vucic, but can they ultimately lead to change in Serbia?
Well, the question is not if, but when, rather. Surveys indicate that a vast majority of Serbian citizens support the demands of the protesters. They've been very successful in carrying the protests really to small towns in Serbia. And I think this is not highlighted enough, because one gets the pictures of the big protests in Belgrade or Novi Sad, but there have been dozens of demonstrations in towns where people didn't have the courage to go to the streets. So I think it's very hard for Vucic to recover from this politically, even if he's able to hold on to power for another half a year or even a year. I think in a certain way, the myth of his omnipotence has been broken by these protests. Now, the question is really just, what will this look like? So this is, I think, the real challenge is, will it be elections? What is the political constellations? The students have been signaling they will put up a list to, in a certain way, be the main carrier of the opposition to the government. But again, how this will pan out and when these elections will be held will be, of course, up to the decision of the president, as we've seen in the past. And that risks being manipulated and being timed in a way when he believes he can win the elections again. So I think there's a great degree of uncertainty ahead in the coming months in Serbia if these incidents and these protests don't lead to some kind of more clarity in the coming weeks.
Tatyana, all of this, of course, began, as we said at the beginning of the programme, after the Novi Sad railway station disaster. After that, Serbia's Prime Minister and the cabinet resigned, along with the mayor of Novi Sad as well. A new government was appointed. Why wasn't that enough for the protesters?
Well, I think that everybody knew that this new cabinet was not really signalling change. The prime minister, which President Vucic appointed, is merely sort of acts as a puppet, and he's been entirely absent in recent days. So that wasn't good enough. I think actually the main question and the main problem is what comes next. The main weakness for the opposition is that there is no united or clear political alternative to Vucic. So even if elections were called tomorrow, for example, we can see that there is such a lot of discontentment with the regime. But without a leader or a political alternative, I think Vucic has a strong hand to play in the elections. In contradistinction to the past, however, when Vucic has been keen to hold elections every few years and did so as a means to consolidate his power, and I think now there is a reluctance to do so, and I think it's unlikely he will go down that path unless they are confident that they can win, or unless there is great political pressure domestically or some sort of external pressure, which I don't expect, which would force him to call elections. But at the moment, we are not in a state of emergency. Society and institutions are still functioning. The numbers at these protests are not so great as those earlier in the year when hundreds of thousands of people did take to the streets. And unfortunately, there are no general strikes. Even the strikes we saw earlier in the year, they were sort of confined to small businesses, to professors, to universities, to people in the arts. So without that, I think he'll hold off on calling elections for as long as he can.
Okay, let's put
but
this.
I think in the end.
Sorry to interrupt you, Tatyana. Let's put this to Mirko. You said that if an election was called tomorrow, then Vucic would lose. But would he? I mean, is the opposition, picking up on what Tatyana was saying, is the opposition organised enough to field a full list of credible candidates, for example? Who would lead the country? Would an election even be free or fair? Could you guarantee that?
No, we don't think we could, but it's the game has been rigged and there is simply no time to change it, nor is there any will on the side of the government to change the rules of the game. And by that, I mean complete monopoly over the state media. So most of the media in Serbia are either owned by pro-regime forces or are silent, like our national broadcaster. You have only three cable operators that are delivering, so to say, independent narrative. When it comes to the opposition, we have oppositional parties and we have the student movement. These two things are distinct. And the students themselves are apprehensive about alliance with the opposition parties, as well about naming any leaders. The reason is that the regime media first conduct character assassinations against any names that suddenly come up, and your entire life ends up being in the press. You are being led through the gut smeared, and then you have certain laws being applied against you. These can be fake accusations or they can be true accusations, but any person that would be signaled to be the leader of the movement would immediately be subjected to legal processes and effectively in a nightmare, his life or her life becoming a nightmare. This is one of the reasons why this movement is leaderless. And even previously, when you would have a leader, he would probably be shifted into the background precisely because of the character assassinations by the regime press. This leads us into a problem. But in the surveys, the people are ready to vote for the student list of the parliament, regardless of who is on this list. I agree this list for now is theoretical. We don't even have elections at the moment. But the surveys indicate that the popularity of the student movement is above 50%.
Florian, Vucic likes to portray himself as a guarantor of stability in Serbia and the Balkans, which critics say allows him and his government to escape criticism from particularly European states. Given that Serbia aspires to EU membership, why hasn't the EU spoken out more loudly about what's going on right now in Serbia?
Well, first of all, the EU has spoken out. The commissioner in charge of enlargement, Marta Kos, did state after a long period of waiting in April that the demands of the students are similar to those of the European Union in terms of rule of law. But the problem is it's been just a statement. There hasn't been any follow-up. And when you're saying Serbia aspires to join the European Union, that is in a certain way only half correct, because officially it does do so, but the government under President Vucic has done very little to actually deal with the real issues required for joining the European Union. Serbia could be on the cusp of joining if the government had actually pursued this. So it's just kind of rhetorically committed to it, but it doesn't want to do the hard job of dealing with corruption, rule of law, and democracy. So in that sense, it's not genuinely pro-European government. And it's been actually also through the media it controls constantly attacking the West and the European Union. The EU has a much worse image today in Serbia than it did a decade ago, and a lot of it is the result of government propaganda. So from that point of view, the EU does have leverage because it is the most important economic partner. But again, many EU member states like Germany and France have really strong economic interests in Serbia, and as a result have been maybe much more quiet than they should have been or could have afforded to be. And this is, I think, really the problem. I think what we also forget is, as you said, Vucic tries to sell himself as a guarantor of stability, but in fact, he's the main pyromaniac in the region. He's been creating tensions and being incendiary in his rhetoric, in his nationalist rhetoric. So in a certain way, this promise of stability, which he makes, is very false in terms of what he's been doing on the ground in Kosovo, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and in Serbia itself.
Tatyana, you were talking about external pressure or the lack thereof. If the EU is not going to weigh in on this, where does Moscow fit into all of this? Vucic has traditionally backed Moscow, refused to align with Western sanctions on Russia after its invasion of Ukraine, for example. To what extent is he walking a tightrope between Moscow and the West?
I think Moscow has less leverage on this. I mean, Belgrade will welcome occasional statements from the Kremlin denouncing the protesters as colour revolutions. But back to the EU, I mean, there is another side to the question that I think there's a recognition in Europe that it might be counterproductive to weigh in, that it might play against the opposition. I mean, this is a country where anti-Western sentiment, anti-interventionist sentiment is strong, and that is not just the result of propaganda or media. It is also the result of history and the legacy of the 90s. So I think many in the EU, as Florian already said, see Vucic as an ally, as a pillar of stability, and their interests in some ways are aligned. For example, on lithium mining, Germany in particular is interested in maintaining Vucic's power because they've agreed to give their critical minerals to the EU.
Mirko, we were talking about the EU's. I mean, okay, the EU has reacted to a certain extent, but not as loudly as perhaps one would expect. Vucic also appears to have supporters in the Trump administration. What hope then do protesters have of affecting change, as it appears that everything at the moment appears to be stacked against them?
You're completely right. The protests have no hope of external intervention or action or pressure from the outside. Professor Bieber and Mrs. Kekic already declared that the European Union has an interest in lithium mining. Imperative for the German car industry to switch to the EV batteries. France, its companies were given public enterprises to run, such as airport. Or Russia, it has its own base in Niš. Serbia is diplomatically supporting Russia. Serbia is also on the side of Israel, delivering her weapons. And to Mr. Trump, I believe that certain prime real estate was promised in Serbia. So you see, this is the idea of President Vucic. If you give a piece of Serbia to each of the great powers, Turkey, China included, there will be no support for the uprisings, for the citizen protests. And I find that his tactic proves here to be correct. The reactions from all of these countries are utterly lacking. The only not truly powerful message came from Marta Kos, the aforementioned EU Commissioner for Enlargement. And it was a rather mild message attacked by both the government and the student movement as being too mild. So I do believe that the students and most of the citizens realize that there is no hope of outside forces doing anything to our favor. You do still have some pro-EU optimists, but they tend to be fewer and fewer.
Okay. Florian, if the current protests fail in their aims and people's distrust of the government continues to grow, what do you think could happen in Serbia? Will the government become even more authoritarian? Will human rights continue to be eroded? What would all of that mean for Serbia's supposed EU membership aspirations?
Well, I mean, I think the EU membership aspiration and the President Vucic government are dead anyhow. They've been not going anywhere for years. I think it's clear that a government, and we see this in Turkey, we see this in other countries which have authoritarian leaders, if we have kind of citizens who are skeptical, who are critical, the governments become more repressive. This is what we can expect in Serbia after these protests. And at the same time, I would say, even if the protests fail, they can be successful in the long run. They've shown some level of solidarity, some ability to organize, to mobilize, to be disciplined for 9 months. When Slobodan Milosevic, in a certain way, the dictator of the 90s was in power, there was a very large student protest, 96, 97. It failed eventually, but it was the necessary precursor for the overthrow of Milosevic 3 years later. So what might seem like a failure, and we don't know yet whether the protests will fail, might be a success down the road. So judgment might come only in a year or two, when maybe these protests were the necessary foundation for a new movement down the road.
Tatyana, just a quick final word from you. We've got under a minute left. Do you agree with what you've just heard?
Yes, I agree. And I think that even if Vucic does call elections because he thinks it's a way to put this all to bed, at the end of the day, it doesn't get rid of that underlying discontent amongst, I think, a majority of the population, and it will just keep coming back in different forms, different protest movements, and hopefully in the end with a political alternative and a leader who could challenge him at the ballot box.
Okay, there we're going to have to end it. Many thanks indeed to you all. Mirko Dautovic, Florian Bieber and Tatyana Kekic. Thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website. That's at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can join us at our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X, our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. We'll see you again. Bye for now.
Don't miss out, get the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news and expert insights. Like, share, stay ahead.